Hello and welcome to our e-learning discussion of the Holocaust. Now, um, we all by now have a pretty good idea of what the Holocaust was all about. We've all learned things about it. We've got preconceived notions of what it was about. If you want a definition, the Holocaust was destruction or slaughter on a mass scale. We typically associate it with one group. Jewish people living in Eastern Europe. The reality is there were more people. That was the largest group, but there were other groups that were going to be impacted by it as well. We also usually associate, large camps, places like Dachau, for example. Um, and the reality was a lot of the Holocaust took place prior to some of these places were even built. So I think it's wise for us to look a little bit more into what really was entailed in throughout all of that. To start out, it actually started with small groups. You had small groups of soldiers that would go across Germany, go out through to the countryside, and were in rural areas looking for groups for once again example Jews, or once they got into Poland, anyone that was not a German would have been somebody that would have been rounded up. You had groups known as gypsies that didn't necessarily have one place to live. That's where these small groups would have, been going out to. A lot of what becomes the Holocaust actually started with these groups going out and confiscating weapons, forcing groups to have to show papers to say this is who I am. It was, in a sense, it was a form of control. It was a way for Germans and specifically the Nazis to gain control over the people that could potentially be seen as troublemakers by them, for example. Um, what winds up happening is they get that control, and then it becomes okay. You are a group that is not desirable here in Germany. They would, take people out into the wilderness and execute them, as you can see in this particular picture. Make them dig their own graves, and then just simply shoot them. If you were a soldier who let's say you had a bit of a conscience and you decided, hey, I believe this is wrong. Chances are you were treated very, very, very harshly because of that, potentially even executed yourself. And again, a form of control. They wanted to control people. Um, so it started out as these groups of soldiers going around and simply performing the executions on their own. The problem that they ran into was while it was effective, it was slow and it was pretty costly. Using one bullet per person in their eyes became a costly expense. So they wanted to find ways to do this in a more efficient and cost-effective manner. What that turns into, is something like this. They started to round groups up. For example, once they got into Poland, they would take over places and they would force, if you were Polish, you had to live in a certain area of the city, would be known as a ghetto. Now, ghetto in this sense is going to be you've got primarily one ethnic group all living in an area. It's probably a fairly poor area, impoverished area, and again, another form of control. They began using these, what is sort of like a mobile execution unit. They would take trucks like this, they would get people into a room, they would use the exhaust from that to pump carbon monoxide in, and that would have served as an execution method. Again, effective, but it didn't always 100% work the way they wanted it to, and it could be kind of costly because of the cost of fuel, and things of that nature. So it wasn't necessarily the foolproof thing that they were looking for. So they kept working to, um, find a way to get rid of large groups of people, in as efficient a manner as possible. Um, that's where the camps come in. And in places like this, when they executed people, they actually would try to keep anything of value. When a lot of these camps were liberated, when the Allies showed up, they found just rooms and rooms and rooms of different things that were confiscated from from these groups, from Jews, for example, prior to their execution. You see on the left here, these are all shoes that were kept. You've got clothing over here. You found in some places eyeglasses, a whole room full of rings, anything and everything that they could have kept. The Germans actually did. So how did these camps actually work? Um, First off, you got to understand that this there's this term concentration camp that gets thrown around a lot, and concentration camp is a proper term. And a concentration camp, though, is just going to be any camp where you're going to take a group of people and you're going to keep them confined in one area. Okay, you're going to concentrate them in one area. So any camp where they would have taken Jews, or Polish people, or um, gypsies, whatever, uh, any place where they would have kept them all in one place, that was going to be considered a concentration camp. Now, once it was determined that you were going to go to one of these places, there were typically two different types. You had work camps, which are exactly what they sound like. You're going to go there and you're going to do some sort of work to further the German war effort. And you had death camps, which again are exactly what they sound like, places where you were going to go to be executed. How did they get there? That's where the trains come in. You would have been loaded onto these box cars, and these were not meant for people. This was meant for cargo. This was meant for animals. This was not intended for people. They would have been all loaded up into these cars. Could have been middle of winter, incredibly cold, and you would have been in here for potentially days. Um, it could have been middle of summer, incredibly hot, and again, you're going to be inside of these. No real way to get fresh air in and out other than a few vents. There were no working bathrooms. You probably just had a bucket in the corner somewhere. I imagine what that would have been like in, say, the middle of July after you've been on a train for a couple of days. Absolutely horrible, horrific conditions, but that's how they would have been transported. Now, you've gotten off the train. You are in your destination, where you're going to go. Now you would have been separated. Okay, you would have separated men from women. You would have separated old from young. If you were someone who was of an age where, hey, you can be useful, you can work, you are somebody who is strong, you're somebody who's fit, you are somebody that probably would have been funneled to a work camp. If you were somebody who was old, somebody who was disabled, somebody who was seen as potentially trouble, you were probably then funneled to a one of the death camps, the execution camps. Um, Children would have gone with mothers, but if you had let's say a son or a daughter who would have fit what could be potentially molded into someone who could be of use to the Nazi regime. You could have been taken from their mother. It happened all the time. If you were somebody who was young enough that they felt like they could brainwash you into forgetting your past and accepting that, hey, we're going to do everything we can for the betterment of Germany, then you were probably put into one of those programs. There were also a lot of really horrific experimental things that were done by a guy by the name of Joseph Mengele. If you've ever heard of a woman named Eva Kor, she was a twin, and she was sent over to this Dr. Mengele, and they did experiments on them to see, would doing something to one twin impact another twin? How would different experiments? It was horrible stuff. Um, but this is where they would have poked and prodded. A lot of times they would have had you dress, completely undress, so that they could see exactly in what kind of shape that you were. Um, so this is where your fate would have kind of been determined. Okay, so now that we've gotten to a point where we have these larger camps, now they're going to start to develop more and more ways to execute people. One of the things that they learned from World War One was you had a new weapon, poisonous gas, that could be used on your enemy. Well, if it could be used on your enemy, then it could be used to potentially exterminate a group of people that the Nazis saw as undesirable. So they started to play around with this idea of poison gas, and they ultimately came across this, what's known as Zyklon B. It was something that would be very effective for what they were wanting to use it for. It was something that was fairly inexpensive. It was something that could be used on a large number of people. So you didn't have to use one bullet per person, for example. You could have one can of this and it could kill hundreds of people. So the idea was the people would be herded. When you'd get off the train at the death camp, and they would be told, "Hey, you're just going into another camp. We need you to shower before you can enter the camp." So they would have had them take all their clothes off again, just making it easier for the Nazis to take what things they wanted later, and would put them into rooms like this. Get them all into a room like this, close and lock the door. Once they had closed and locked the door, and they were sure that everything was secured, then they would drop this Zyklon B into smokestacks that would have come down into the room. At that point, it would have interacted with the elements around it, and it would have released this poison gas. So everyone in this room would have then been would have been executed. Pretty horrible situation. Once this was done, then soldiers would come in. They would drag people out to a nearby area where the bodies would have been disposed of, either mass graves. They had furnaces in some places where they would have burned some people. But especially towards the end of the war, they started to do this so quickly because they felt like they were going to lose, that bodies started piling up and piling up and piling up. And there again, you think middle of summer, as bodies start piling up, it just became an insanely awful experience. So the two videos that you're going to watch, the first one has to do with how it all kind of came to be. And that is done by a group that has made it their mission to kind of keep this alive, and make it so that people are learning from the horrible things that have happened in the past because of hatred and bigotry and things like that. The other one is going to be from the show Band of Brothers, where they're going to go in and actually liberate one of the camps. From what I'm told, what they show in the Band of Brothers clip is actually fairly mild compared to the realities of what would have happened in these. So, not easy things to go over, but there's an old saying that those who do not learn from the mistakes of the past are destined to repeat it. If we don't learn about things like this, that would certainly lead us to believe that situations could exist where we would maybe allow these things to happen again in the future. And I want to make sure that we're doing everything that we possibly can to prevent anything like that from ever happening. So while this is a very heavy subject, ultimately something that we really do need to learn